Yeah, so I came to the end of 4 years of being a college student, and I didn't have enough credits to graduate, and I hadn't been the best student at Rutgers, and I had a very sort of vague notion that I wanted to be some kind of writer, but had no conception of how to go about doing that, really. So I just took whatever job that was available to me, working for one of those weekly newspapers that they throw onto your lawn for free, whether you ask for it or not, every week, and just did the very basic sort of nuts and bolts reporting, going to planning board meetings and local town meetings in suburban New Jersey. And so there's nothing that interesting about it. I did that for a while, and then I went to a similar daily newspaper, that sort of a Gannett daily newspaper, and continued to do that for a few years. And all along sort of doing sort of private experiments and other forms of writing that I was interested in doing. None of it that would have been seen as publishable, I don't think, until at one point I had a friend of mine who started to write for one of the early web publications, a magazine called Salon, and through him, I made contact with some people in New York City who were part of the literary world there, and we met a young writer, a guy named Keith Gesson, who was starting a publication at that time called N+1, and I was present as a kind of vague hanger-on for the first couple of years of that publication, and then I ran something in that magazine, which was the first essay in this collection called The Face of Sung-Wi Cho, which was a kind of personal essay / cultural observation and reading of this event that is now largely a sort of forgotten event, but at the time was big news because it was the largest mass killing in American history at the time that it happened, and there were certain sort of elements of it that have become kind of recurrent or even cliched things that were new at the time, because he sort of orchestrated a whole media spectacle around his attack, where he had sent a manifesto to various TV networks, and he'd made videos of himself that he posted where he sort of fantasized himself as a warrior on behalf of a new sort of disfavored, marginalized group, that being sort of just the loser, right? The loser qua loser writ large. And anyway, these are all things that I discuss at length, and I also talk about to what degree sort of his Asian American identity or some kind of politics of racial grievance did or did not impinge upon this event. And it was not the way he sort of understood himself, but it was the source of the kind of disturbed and disturbing empathy one felt with him, because one shared something in common with him and a certain kind of obscene knowledge of a sort of a form of erasure that one felt one had experienced. And so that's what the kind of topic of the essay ended up being. It's really hard to kind of describe it retroactively, right? It became a piece of prose that came to exist in the world, and on the basis of that, really on the basis of that one essay, I was, because it was a publication that sort of directly injected those writers into the sort of bloodstream of the New York publishing and journalistic world. Like, it served that function as a kind of farm team for major publications. And after that, I was asked to write for New York Magazine. And subsequent to that, then, I have been able to sort of eke out a precarious existence, doing nothing other than going from one assignment to the next for one magazine after the other on a variety of different subjects of the sort that appear in the book. So the book is just a kind of record of 10 years of that work. None of these pieces were written with a pre-existing design. And the book, in fact, is a kind of confession of failure in a specific sense, that like I was I did another article that appears in the collection called Paper Tigers, which, you know, at the time was a kind of novel thing where you sort of troll an entire racial group, right? And you know, it was the most viral thing in the history of New York Magazine when it came out. It has since become a kind of pattern that other publications, BuzzFeed in particular, have followed on, and there's now an oversaturated market for this sort of thing. But at the time it was new, and it was the most trafficked thing that they had ever done. And on the basis of that, then, I was able to get a book proposal to do something on Asian American identity, which is in many ways a problematic subject for a lot of reasons. And I had some personal sort of difficulties in my life that made it hard for me to complete that book. Layered atop the intrinsic problems of sort of conceiving of the Asian American identity in a way that has a story with a beginning, middle, and an end. So I did a lot of reporting. I have lots of interesting fragments of things, including some time I spent in 2011 and 2012 with an interesting character that had got in touch with me after my New York Magazine piece came out, a guy named Andrew Yang, who was starting an organization called Venture for America, whose purpose was to sort of bring back the spirit of entrepreneurship to demoralized, deindustrialized parts of the American Rust Belt, among other places. So an interesting concept. He was somebody who had just sort of sold his test preparation company and was starting to do something kind of dramatically other than what one would expect such a person to do. But it wasn't quite the story that it would then go on to be. So, you know, so Andrew Yang, like the book, was done in advance of sort of the emergence of Andrew Yang as the person that he's since become. The book, in many ways, was conceived of as dealing with the problematic in which Andrew Yang would then emerge, which is that of sort of, well, why is it that there is no discourse or no yearning in this country for the Asian American president, right? And of course, to pose that question is already to sort of, we all sort of know why, right? But like, we can't quite articulate it, or we don't exactly want to articulate it. And this is all sort of the subtext of that ended up sort of being worked out in a kind of awkward way in the course of Yang's presidency, or you know, his bid for the presidency, and the unusual, you know, he underperformed quite badly in Iowa. There's a decent chance he might do well in New Hampshire. We'll see where that goes. But he went from being a person without sort of conspicuous charisma, without an inspiring life story, without great personal wealth of his own, without any prior political experience, nothing other than a particular vision of his own, the open platforms of the internet, a skill in sort of generating viral spectacles on the internet, and the ability to compel the loyalty of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Americans, in him as a kind of central figure within the American drama, which of course is the Asian American conundrum, right? Because the Asian Americans are the group that have the sort of highest median income in America. And in many ways, when you measure group outcomes, a variety of different group outcomes, from income to education to the incarceration rate and so on, there's always a hierarchy that goes Asian Americans, followed by whites. So for instance, like a white person is twice as likely to be shot by a police officer than an Asian American, right? And so there's this Asian American white gap that persists all throughout every measurable indus of American life. And of course the answer to that, of course, is that it's a highly selected group of immigrants, but it's highly selected for something, right? There's a thing that they're being selected for, and what's that thing, right? That thing is not whiteness, right? The Asian Americans aren't white, and so the Asian Americans are sort of problematic in this way. On the other hand, there's a virtual absence of Asian Americans as figures in popular culture and political culture, in anything that is visible within the culture. Now, does that have something to do with the sort of cultural baseline of Asian Americans? Probably has something to do with it. Does it have something to do with a kind of way that they are regarded as other in this peculiar way where there's a cultural erasure of them? It probably has something to do with that too. And so it's a very kind of like esoteric set of problems, and it was all the more esoteric back when I was attempting to write about it. I think Andrew Yang is an excellent vehicle. I could probably write about it through him. That book could have been finished, but it wasn't. Instead, the book got killed. I ended up owing my advance, which, and they sent me some letters saying, you have to pay us this, and of course they're never going to see that money, and so they decided then, what are we going to do? And at a certain point we decided, well, maybe we have these old essays and we can put them together, and we put the essays together, and I read through them, and despite the fact that they were not written with any sort of design in advance, they had a kind of coherence, not of a set of propositions, but of a coherence of sensibility, which is mine, and they had a kind of relevance as well. So on the one hand, like, is it good, like, do these writings that were kind of done one-off, do they stand up as a book? And like, do they deserve to be preserved in this form? And after reading it, I thought, yeah, they do. And do they actually make a statement that is worth thinking about or hearing in the year 2018 when they came out? And I also felt that, yes, they do. The things that I was interested in sort of back in 2005 and 2007 about the tensions around masculine identity and so on, all of them, they catalyzed into something. They catalyzed in something that manifested itself in the year 2016 and that continue to manifest themselves. And sort of the idea sort of struck me that there was a certain destiny for the Asian American in a fraught and racially polarized time in American life, which is to serve as a kind of mediating figure. And sort of Andrew Yang then emerged in a way that sort of models that future, because the future that we look at and the future that we have right now is, it's said that in the year 2040 we're going to be, we'll be a majority-minority country, which means that, black people, white people will be less than 50% of the country. But what that means is that we will be a plurality, non-white, non-black country. And that's very different than the way we think about it. We still think of the country as a super majority white country with a small and sort of justifiably aggrieved and oppressed black minority that has a terrible history, that is the original sin of the country. But in fact, we're something else already, right? We are already sort of we are on the way to a kind of majority non-white country, but we are already a supermajority non-black country, right? We're a non-black, non-white country in a way that hasn't quite sort of filtered in, because neither the Asian American nor the Hispanic American have really made themselves felt culturally, politically. And the manner in which they are going to make themselves felt culturally, politically is what is being contested with such ferocity at the moment, which is why there is this sort of this recrudescence of the language of white supremacy, and at precisely the moment, right, where it is a thing that is ceasing to be, because there is an attempt to make it so, right, or make it be so that the future is one in which the white majority is so irrevocably toxic and tainted that it can only be overawed and defeated by a coalition of all non-white people, right? And then but that's probably not what's going to happen, and we probably shouldn't tell white people that that's what's going to happen, because A, because it's not true, and B, because it doesn't have good effects on them to threaten them in that way, and one shouldn't. right? Especially because it's not true. So in fact, like, we're a non-white, non-black country, and how that is going to manifest itself, we're going to look toward these new groups to serve as a balance. And so Andrew Yang is a kind of 1.0 version of what it means for somebody to take that, to manifest the specific positionality of the Asian American as a group that is invisible at the time when we've made whiteness visible. The Asian American's invisibility, the fact that he is sort of not really sort of seen as an oppressed group and not really seen as an oppressor group, because they're not really either, although they have grievances and although there are those that are aggrieved against them, including, to say nothing of the white Asian gap of which I speak, which is a fact, which has to do with the specific demographics of immigration into the country, who came here, a highly selected group, but a highly selected group also that brings over a certain cultural baseline, a cultural baseline where many people from the Pacific Rim that come here are coming from cultures that have determined the fate of their young people on the basis of a single high stakes examination for 1,000 years. And so, like, it's normal to spend X percentage of your income preparing for a single high stakes examination for this group of people. So when you parachute this group of people into a system like the one that we have that places some strong, great emphasis upon educational testing, the outcome is going to be like those that we see at Stuyvesant High School, which is it's a school it's an elite high school that you test into by taking an examination. You take one exam, and on the basis of that you get in or you don't, depending on where you fall on that hierarchy. Those schools are 70 to 80% Asian immigrants, and they're not, New York City, the Asian population there has the highest poverty rate of any group in the country. So, like, if the percentage that you're putting of your income that you're putting in for paid test preparation is 30 or 40, because you're working 2 jobs in a garment factory and as a delivery man, that's something that you do. And that is something that is variable by culture, and that's something that this particular culture happens to bring with it. And so what that does is it's very disruptive, right? Like, it's very hard to have both, on the one hand, sort of this degree of diversity where there are those who are recipients of affirmative action, and then there is a small minority that is so dominant on one important criterion. And yet, nonetheless, I write about how sort of like Asians are very present in the professional world, but they are very absent in the higher reaches of management and leadership. And of course, this has something to do with making a cultural adjustment for a new group of people. And it also has to do with kind of the sort of cultural erasure that I also speak about. Like, both of these things are true, and I try to deal with them both. And I try to deal with them when I was asked to write about this. There was an article that came out around 2011 by a law professor named Amy Chua, where she wrote about tiger parenting, and she wrote about, and this was a viral article that was trolling a whole race of people, and it was very successful for her, but it was also like a description of like a real practice. And of course, to many people, this looks like abuse. To many people, this, including many Asian people, this opened up traumatic memories. And to other people, it was indicative of the disturbing practices that result in the outcomes that I were describing, that produces very unpleasant conditions of competition for everybody else that has to compete with them for educational credentialing of a certain kind, right? And she was, Amy Chua, like, she was just going for it, right? And it was like kind of like a mortifying book in some ways, but it also like told some important truths, and it was, and then so I was asked to write something in reply to that. And that's what Paper Tigers was. And it was a kind of, it didn't end up being the kind of sharp rejoinder that it was originally, that I sort of originally was inclined to see it as. in much the same way that my sort of view of kind of Asian test preparation and the sort, initially I was very skeptical of it, and I started to report it with an attitude of, being hostile to it. But then I saw what was actually happening in those schools, right? Like people, they just had they had a culturally determined, very different attitude toward it. We see test prep as tantamount almost to a kind of cheating, right? They see it as a kind of test of will, right? So like in Korea, there's a maxim for those who are applying they're studying to the test that leads to college admissions. And what they would say is, if you sleep 5 hours a night, you won't get in. But if you sleep 4 hours, there's a chance you'll get in. You won't necessarily get in, but you might get in if you sleep 4 hours. And so people sacrifice their whole 6th grade to 12th grade to this idol. I spoke to a woman there in Seoul who was number 1. And at the end of it, was very, she number 1 in the whole country, right? And she was very disillusioned, obviously, with what this brought to her because she sacrificed her whole happiness to it. And in the end, actually, despite this strict meritocracy academically, everything is owned by a handful of families that run the large, conglomerates, and everything is totally nepotistic, right? So there's this intense meritocracy at the school level, total nepotism once you get out the door, and all you can aspire to is just to be a not that well paid retainer of somebody that inherited everything. And so for her, nonetheless, so it's taken to that extreme. You have a whole culture that sacrifices its happiness and its youth to that. On the other hand, you have a very functional culture where people are actually quite competent, right? And they were able to take themselves on the basis of that from being a completely sort of war-torn, impoverished wreck of a country at the end of the Korean War to having various first world problems. In 2020, there's the sort of the plastic surgery industry in China or in Korea is such that Chinese people go there to have their surgery done, and it's done so ingeniously that when the Chinese people they get home, they don't match their IDs anymore. So they have to bring in their parents have to come and identify them and confirm they are who they are. But that was done in the space of one generation. They moved from sort of pauperdom to sort of postmodern decadence of the deepest kind, and they did it on the basis of their system, and it's a system that worked for them. And so the immigrants that come here are engaging in a system that makes things unpleasant for other people, but it's a system that works for them. And it works to do what we want our educational system to do, which is to take people, newcomers who barely speak the language of little economic means, and to put them on the path to upward mobility. And the way they do this reliably gets them to where they want to go. And so, how could I remain opposed to that? And why would I not defend it? So that's what I sort of have been doing more recently, saying okay, this is what they do, problematic in certain ways. One can criticize it, but it really works, and there's a reason they do it. And to sort of take that thing away from them would be to do harm to them, and they have a right to stand up and try to defend it. And I'm not so much defending it as itself as I am defending their right to defend themselves.